Maybe you've heard of Mark Masclans. He's pretty good at miniature painting. I've been following his work for years, and a lot of people cite him as one of their favorite miniature artists. For me, what makes his work so distinct is the visible brushstrokes that result from not overpainting the same areas continuously. And I want to steal some of that. I've personally made some pieces over the years that have been important milestones to me, but my actual approach to painting has hit a bit of a plateau. So maybe if I try to paint something how Mark would paint it, which is totally different than how I currently paint, I can inject something new into my approach. But in order to do that, we're going to need to analyze how Mark works first. I found this video Mark did for Camaro where he sketches a bust that's kind of similar to the one I'll be painting. I'm going to go back and forth between watching Mark's painting video before I start painting and analyzing the video of what I did afterward. Let's see how Mark starts a sketch. Looks like he's mixed a shadow tone for his skin, and he's putting it just like across the whole thing. So he's like base coated the entire skin area with his shadow skin color. So this is going to be like a building up from shadows to highlights, layering kind of thing. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and try to do Mark's first step here, and it seems to be starting off okay. We can't really get off track this early. And while we watch me base this in, I'll mention that this mini I'm painting is an academic bust I sculpted for classes and is also available as an STL. It has a crazy feature that I haven't seen on any bust before, which I'll demonstrate after we've painted some more. But anyway, I think this base coat is down okay, so let's see what Mark does next. Looks like he's mixing a midtone. No, so that's actually a shadow. So he started base coating not with his deepest shadows, but with like just above the deepest shadows, because then he mixed in red and that was his deepest shadow. I mixed the shadow color, but as I'm applying it, I can tell it's too desaturated and too low in value compared to what Mark did. And by the time I'm noticing this, I've already basically painted the entire cast shadow on the neck, so I'm just going to forge ahead and see what happens next. So now he's mixing in a bunch of yellow, and I think he's making a midtone now. So now he's actually kind of blocking in shapes. It looks like he's actually doing a straight up Rembrandt-like, because you can see like the triangle on the camera right cheek. And sometimes it seems like he's almost adding like a chaos to the brush direction. And that's like his way of making like non-uniform edges to the layers. So I'm trying to do the same thing here. I added some yellow to my midtone, went up a step in value, and now I'm painting the highlight on the volumes in a smaller area. At this point, I'm feeling pretty good about the start, but I don't know at this point that I'm about to run into trouble and learn my first big Mark Masclans lesson. Just listen to me talk while I watch the video how it's quote-unquote pretty straightforward. This is pretty straightforward, right? It's like smaller and smaller layers of like increasing value, and like each layer also gets more of a yellow bias. So like the shadow to highlight has like a red to yellow kind of chroma differential in addition. Oh, I gotta fucking add. So the shadow to highlight gets like a red to yellow chroma differential while also raising in value. So we're doing like all of that at once. So I made another midtone step by adding some yellow and white, but as I start painting, I realize that I've made way too much of a luminance jump, and I've also lost a lot of saturation. If you look at what Mark is at this stage, it's still living very much in the midtones and still very saturated. I basically brought into a place of highlights and shadows with very little midtones, and I've lost a lot of saturation. So this is really where I learned my first big lesson about how Mark paints. It's really very midtone dense for the majority of the painting and only really establishes the peak highlights towards the end of the sketch. This is basically the opposite of how I paint. Like here's an earlier version of the sculpt that I sketched in my normal way. I start by marking the highlights in white at first, basically starting from only highlights and shadows, and then I build in the midtones last. And also since I'm starting with a black and white sketch, I have literally no saturation. And I build in the saturation later with inks, like on this horn here. So what I'm seeing here is my normal tendencies creeping in and taking over, even while I'm just trying to follow what Mark is doing. And so unfortunately, in order to get the skin back on track, I end up having to go back through and paint over a lot of the midtones. This is something that would be normal in the way that I usually paint, but in Mark's video, he does the entire sketch from lower midtones to highlights without ever reversing direction. Okay, back to my video watchdown analysis where I'm oblivious to how hard I'd struggle just to get to this stage. And now he's kind of using it just to do like peak highlights. Okay, sure, so now that I've recalibrated my midtones, I can start to do the peak highlights. From here, there's just a lot of fiddling with highlight detail. By the end of the initial skin pass, here's where I'm at. You can see that it's still not as saturated or midtones down as Mark's, but it's gotten closer. Also, Mark stopped in the middle of doing the skin in order to base the hair, but I decided to go section at a time so I could track his steps. So next I'll go into watching how he paints the hair and then trying to replicate that. So now we're mixing up hair color. It looks like it's being mixed from like the same red shadow color that he used for the skin tone. It's just way more saturated and way more like a red bias. So I start by mixing a shadow color for the hair, and clearly this is a lot more yellow and higher value than what Mark mixed. I think I probably did this subconsciously because, again, my personal tendency is to want to have a lot of impact on the first paint I put down, I'm usually starting with white on black, which is basically maximum impact. So it's kind of like maximum impact first, get the light painted on, and figure out the subtlety later. So that was my second big Mark lesson, which is that even though he is known for his expressive brushstrokes, he's really a subtlety first kind of painter. To paint the way he paints, you have to be willing to sit through layer after layer of paint going down on the Mini without really getting a sense of what the final result is going to look like until you're at the end of the sketch. I also noticed something he did that at first seemed like not a big deal, but I eventually realized it was important, which is he started at the beginning with a small blast of airbrushed white primer coming from the direction of his light. This is something I would never normally do because I usually define the light myself with thick white paint, so any white primer would just get in the way. But with this style of painting, not having the white primer means you just have to keep putting down extra layers of your base coat in order to get that coverage, which you can see me doing on the hair. So that was my second big Mark lesson and lesson for painting up in layers in general, which is that starting from pure black is a little bit of a hindrance. I know that most people paint with some kind of layering and using zenithal priming, so you're probably thinking, yeah, that's obvious, but how I paint normally, something like this would really get in my way. Okay, let's see what Mark does next. Basically looks like what he's doing is like, as we go from shadow to midtone to highlight, there's like a common yellow highlight tone basically that gets mixed in continuously as you go up from like shadow to highlight. I also see that he's controlling the material. The surface area of the hair that he's painting with the midtone is like way smaller than the surface area of the midtone that he painted on the skin. It looks like that's how he's controlling the ratio shadow to midtone to highlight. So I start doing the same thing here, mixing higher value yellow to layer up to. Basically, this is the exact same layering technique he used on the skin. The only difference is that it's a smaller amount of midtone to paint because hair is more reflective. So we're painting a smaller specular reflection more so than a larger diffuse reflection. Additionally, whereas the skin brush strokes were a little more chaotic in terms of direction because he was trying to find a soft, dithered fall off, the brush strokes on the hair have to follow the direction of the hair because that's the direction of the fall off. So this is different now. This doesn't look like the highlight he wants. This is like way brighter than I would have expected. So I'm not sure where this is going. So now he's like over painting it with a higher midtone. So I'm not sure what that's about. I'm not sure if that's a corrective step or if he just wanted to do an overpainting. I guess maybe I should listen to this with audio, but okay. So I did go back and listen to the video with audio. He's putting down the white first because he wants to really push the value up, so it's a big jump when he overpaints it with more saturated color. And this is again because it's a specular reflection on the hair more so than a diffuse reflection, and he needs a sharper value transition. And by the way, I did make a video about how to think about painting reflections, which I'll link to at the end of this video. And now he's going in on the hair and putting in the deepest shadow. So he kind of did the hair out of order from the face, because if you remember the face, he did the deepest shadow right at the beginning, and now he's like doing the deepest shadow on the hair last. So now I'm going in and painting the shadow. Looking back at what Mark did, it does look like he kept the highlight areas of the hair much smaller, leaving more midtone, while I painted them much more broad. And that's related back to his midtones down style, which I've really struggled to get into headspace of, because it's not how I see things rendered in my brain. If you look at my work, it's all very shadows and highlights with sharp midtone transitions. I just don't like to live in the midtone. So this is a third lesson I've taken away from this, which is a more broad lesson, which is that forcing yourself to try and paint like someone else can teach you just as much about your own painting tendencies as someone else's painting tendencies. So let's see how Mark paints this gold. Now it looks like he's doing the same thing on the gold. He's starting with like a shadow color on the gold the same way he did with the face, but obviously has more of like a yellow bias. And then it looks like the same deal. He's layering in midtones and then like more highlights. These little bands on the camera right side of the headband are interesting, right? Those aren't created directly by his quote-unquote Rembrandt light. I guess that's supposed to be like the implication of like a secondary reflection or something. So at this point, we've kind of got the idea. He starts with a shadow color and uses progressively sketched-in layers to build in a dense, saturated midtone, and only defines a relatively small area of peak highlight at the end. I was progressively more and more successful with this on different materials as I moved through the bust. I felt like even though I wasn't very good at painting like Mark, I was understanding the mentality, which is where I arrived at my fourth big lesson from this process, which is that Mark is really good at painting like Mark, and I'm really good at painting like me. So when you try to paint like someone else, whether it's because you honestly want to emulate them or just as an exercise to get out of your routine like what I'm doing, it's important to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And to understand that when you're struggling to learn, and you shouldn't be struggling to try to get a good result. Because the result doesn't really matter. What matters is that you learn from the process. But that being said, I'll still show you the result. This is where I was at after doing the initial sketch. In Mark's video, after he's done with the layering, he went in and did some glazing to complete the sketch. So I spent an extra hour doing some glazing and stippling and ended up with this as the final piece. Here's Mark's final piece from his Instagram, so you can see the result is a lot different, but I think you can see his technique ideas reverberating on my piece. Also, a little more about this bust. I've been working on a sculpt for this academic bust and printing them out, painting them, and then using what I learned to iterate on the design. The first few versions had horns, but I got universal feedback that literally everyone hated the horns. So this version I just painted was version 3, and now I've got a huge batch of version 4 being made. You can see some major differences, such as a redesign on her scarf and better geometry on the crown. But the killer feature that I mentioned earlier is that the bust comes with an optional plaque that it can fit into, allowing you to do a painted background version. There's also an optional handle that doubles as a plinth. In a few weeks, I'm going to be teaching a weekend workshop at Verco's Vault where we're going to be painting this bust and talking about how to render light, material, and color while developing a sketch. And if you're watching this video close to when it drops and you're interested in the workshop, check out the link in the description. And finally, if you're interested in printing and painting this bust, I made it available for download on my Patreon. So thanks for watching, and here's a video of me talking more about painting light and material.